In 1974, two brave explorers decided to push the limits of what was possible in cave diving. They ventured into the Agen Allwedd caves in Wales, hoping to find more than anyone had ever discovered before. Sadly, their exciting adventure turned into a nightmare, and one of them even lost his life. This is the tragic story of the Agen Allwedd diving accident. Let's meet the explorers. Martin Farr, a 23-year-old guy who easily squeezed through tight cave passages. Roger Solari was 26. He was a bit larger than Martin, but was just as adventurous. Martin and Roger were the best friends. They had been exploring caves together for almost 10 years, and cave diving was new to them. They had only been doing it for about 3 years. Cave diving is very different from regular caving. In a dry cave, you can usually find a way out if something goes wrong, but you depend completely on your diving gear in a flooded cave passage. If something breaks or you run out of air, you can't just swim to the surface. Martin and Roger knew the risks, but they were excited about the chance to discover something new. They wanted to be the first to explore the deepest parts of the Agen Allwedd cave. Agen Allwedd Cave is located in South Wales, UK. It's one of the longest cave systems in the country, stretching for over 20 miles underground. The cave has several water-filled tunnels called sumps. To get through them, you need scuba diving gear. In 1974, 3 of these sumps were explored. Martin and Roger wanted to be the first to go beyond the 3rd sump. On June 15, 1974, Martin and Roger arrived at the cave entrance. They had a lot of gear with them: diving suits, air tanks, lights, and ropes. All of this had to be carried deep into the cave before they could even start diving. The journey to the first sump was challenging. They had to crawl through narrow tunnels and climb over big rocks. Sometimes the passages were so tight that they had to push their gear ahead and wiggle through. It took them hours to reach the water. By the time they had gotten there, they were already tired. They were so excited. This is what they had come for. Martin and Roger put on their diving gear and slipped into the cold, dark water of the first sump. This underwater tunnel was about 250 feet long. They swam through it carefully, following a guideline that previous explorers had left. They came up in an air-filled chamber on the other side. After catching their breath, they went through the second sump. This one was shorter, only about 85 feet. So far, everything was going according to plan. Martin and Roger were in good spirits when they reached the air chamber after the second sump, but the real challenge was still ahead: the unexplored 3rd sump. No one knew how long this underwater tunnel was or what was on the other side. Martin and Roger were about to find out. They checked their air supplies and diving gear one last time. Then they entered the water of the 3rd sump. This time they swam side by side. Martin was laying out a new guideline as they went. This thin rope would be their way to find their way back. The passage went much deeper than they had expected. Soon they were about 70 feet below the surface. The water was cold and dark. Their lights only showed a few feet ahead. After swimming about 400 feet, Roger had started having problems. His sinuses were hurting. This sometimes happened to him when diving deep. Martin saw that Roger was uncomfortable and he signaled that they should turn back. But Roger didn't want to give up. He'd come so far, and he signaled that he was going to be okay if they kept going. So they continued, with Martin now in the lead. He kept laying out the guidelines as they swam. The passage seemed to go on and on, sloping downward. Martin was starting to worry about their air supply. He knew that they should turn back soon, but he was sure that they must be close to the end of the sump. There may be an air-filled cave chamber ahead, so he decided to go further. Finally, after swimming about 500 feet, Martin saw something exciting. The passage was going upwards. Could this be the end of the sump? He swam upward, hoping to break through to an air pocket, but instead of air, he hit solid rock. The passage had ended in a dead end. Now Martin knew that they were in trouble. He'd gone too far, and he was dangerously low in air. He turned a signal to Roger that they needed to head back immediately. But when he looked at Roger, he saw a scary sight. Roger's eyes were wide with panic. He was making strange movements. Something needed to be fixed. Martin didn't know if Roger had run out of air or had another problem, but he knew that they both needed to get out of there fast. He grabbed Roger and tried to turn him around, but Roger seemed confused. He needed to follow Martin's lead. Martin was faced with a terrible choice. If he stayed to help Roger, they might just run out of air. But if he left Roger, his friend might not make it out. Martin made the hardest decision of his life. With his lungs burning for air, he had to try to get out to go back for help. He gave Roger's arm one last squeeze and turned and began swimming as fast as he could along the guideline. The journey back seemed to take forever. Martin's air was almost gone and his chest hurt from holding his breath. The dark tunnel seemed endless. Just when he thought he couldn't hold on any longer, Martin burst to the surface of the air chamber. He gulped in huge breaths. His heart was pounding. As soon as he could speak, he shouted Roger's name, but there was no answer, just the echo of his voice in the cave. Martin waited by the water's edge, hoping to see bubbles or some sign of his friend. Minutes ticked by, and the end of an hour passed. With a heavy heart, Martin had to accept the truth. Roger wasn't coming back. Something had gone wrong in that underwater tunnel. Martin was overwhelmed with sadness and guilt. Should he have insisted they turn back earlier? Should he have stayed with Roger? These questions would haunt him for years to come. But Martin knew he couldn't stay in the cave. He had to get out and get help. A rescue team could save Roger. The journey back through the first 2 sumps was like a bad dream. Martin was exhausted and his head was pounding. He was sick with worry about Roger. When he finally emerged from the cave, Martin immediately called for help. A rescue team was quickly organized and led by John Parker, one of the best cave divers in Britain. But when the rescue team arrived at the cave, they faced a new problem. Heavy rain had raised the cave's water level and the sump's current was now very strong. It was too dangerous for anyone to dive. The rescuers had to wait several frustrating days for the water to recede. All they could do was hope that Roger had somehow found an air pocket and was still alive. Finally, the water levels dropped enough for the rescue team to enter the cave. They made their way to the 3rd sump and began their search. The divers searched for hours in the cold, dark water. They reached the end of the passage where Martin had turned back, but they found no sign of Roger. After 10 hours of searching, the rescue team had to give up. The diving conditions were too dangerous to continue. With heavy hearts, they had to leave the cave without Roger. In the days and weeks that followed, most searches were done, but they never found any trace of Roger or his equipment. It seemed that Roger Solari would remain forever in the dark depths of Agen Allwedd cave. So what exactly happened to Roger in those final moments underwater? We can never know for sure, but there are a few possibilities. One theory is that Roger got tangled in the guidelines while trying to switch to his reserve air tank. Cave divers often carry a knife to cut themselves free if this happens. Roger might have cut the line to free himself, but lost his way in the dark, marked through water. Another possibility is that Roger had some kind of medical problem underwater. Maybe the pain in his sinuses got worse, or he had a blackout. Without Martin there to help him, he would have quickly run out of air. Or perhaps Roger's air supply ran out faster than he expected. In the panic of realizing he was out of air, he might have made a wrong turn or swam away from the guideline. Whatever happened, it's clear that several things went wrong in this dive. First, Martin and Roger should have gone further on their air supply. There's a rule in diving called the rule of thirds. It says you should use 1/3 of your air to enter a cave and keep 1/3 as a safety reserve. Martin and Roger broke this rule by going too far. Second, they made the risky choice to separate underwater. Cave divers are supposed to stay close to their buddy at all times. If Martin and Roger had stayed together, they may have helped each other out when problems started. Third, they were pushed into an unknown territory beyond their experience level. It might have been wiser to turn back around when Roger started having problems. Roger's death was devastating for everyone who knew him. His family and friends were heartbroken, and the caving community mourned the loss of a passionate explorer. Martin Farr was deeply affected by the accident. He felt guilty for leaving Roger, even though he knew that he had no choice if he wanted to survive and get help. The memory of that day would stay with him forever. But Martin didn't give up cave diving. He became one of the most experienced cave divers in Britain. He used the lessons learned from the Agen Allwedd incident to become safer and more careful in his explorations. In the following years, Martin returned to Agen Allwedd cave several times. He hoped to find some clue about what happened to Roger, but the cave kept its secrets. Finally, in 1986, 12 years after the accident, Roger's body was found. The 2 cave divers, Ian Rowland, and Julian Walker, were exploring the 3rd sump when they made the sad discovery. Roger's body was about 720 feet into the underwater tunnel, much further than where Martin last saw him. Somehow, in his final moments, Roger had managed to swim an additional 200 feet deeper into the cave. Because of how difficult it was to reach this part of the cave, it was decided to leave Roger's body where it was. Trying to bring him out would have been too dangerous for other divers. A year later, in 1987, the very end of the 3rd sump was finally reached. Ian Walker swam the full 875 feet through the underwater tunnel, passing Roger's body on his way to discover a small air-filled chamber at the end. This chamber was named Against All Odds. It was a bittersweet discovery. The cave passage that Roger and Martin had dreamed of finding was real, but the cost of this knowledge needed to be lowered. Today, the entrance to Agen Allwedd cave is locked. Only very experienced cavers with special permission are allowed to enter. Near the first sump, there's a plaque in memory of Roger Solari. Near the first sump, there's a plaque in memory of Roger Solari. The Agen Allwedd accident changed cave diving in Britain. It led to stricter safety rules, better training for cave divers, and improved equipment to make it safer and more reliable. And Roger Solari's excitement turned to tragedy when Roger didn't resurface. What if they had turned back sooner? What if they hadn't separated underwater? Roger's fate might have been different. This accident reminds us of the dangers of cave diving and the importance of following safety rules. Roger's body, found 12 years later, remains in the cave, a somber reminder of the fateful day. If you found the story captivating, please hit the subscribe button. If you want to hear more tales of adventures and explorations, well, stay tuned for our next video. Thank you.